but we are about to watch Mason Clark in the feature match area with his slightly thicker than expected deck here, Andrew.
Oh yeah, I am aware of that, and I am annoyed about it. I would like the record to reflect that. But that's neither here nor there. My understanding is that Mason is going to be facing off against Tron in this round. Is that
Mm.
correct? Um,
We will try and get confirmation of that for you, but this has traditionally been one of the main enemies of dirtily four-color decks and all of their guises. So probably not the matchup Mason is hoping for here.
yeah, presuming that is correct, what Mason's going to need to try to do is assemble a Boseiju Ren lock, or potentially the more elaborate Eternal Witness Ephemerate Boseiju lock. Oh wait, okay, that is not the case. My apologies. I was misinformed. Um,
Okay, Living End, a very different matchup, one that presents its own challenges, but probably one that Mason is a lot happy to see, I would guess.
For sure, for sure. Living End versus Four Color has traditionally been the hardest Cascade matchup for Four Color, but still not necessarily a bad matchup. Typically, I would say that it's close, and whose favor depends on the specifics of the Four Colorless sideboard. Um,
And this is a matchup where you often see lines that you never would under other circumstances. So just casting Solitude for no value just to get it in the graveyard, sending your own permanents to the garbage bin just to get them there in case of a living end. There's a lot of stuff like that which you never see in any other matchup in Modern, but that is part of the charm of the format. That stuff like that is possible and correct sometimes.
Yeah, and it looks like there is a counterspell in Mason's hand, which in game one against Living End is worth its weight in gold, as you have very few ways to stop their namesake card, and you kind of need to.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of these various four-color approaches recently. So full-on tribal elementals, and then more blink-focused approaches. Mason is playing something kind of like he was playing back in the Yorion days, just scaled down a bit, just conventional four-color with his iterations and corrals, and crucially counterspell, as you mentioned. And just like we said with the Murktide versus Breach comparison last round, sometimes what you need is just a card that says counter target spell, and counterspell certainly does that.
Yeah, so generally the core dynamic of this matchup is four color is pretty decent at making small living ends awkward. That is, if you go for a small living end, four color will like evoke a solitude in response. The solitude will come back and exile something. Then they'll play an Ice Fang or a kill spell and clean it up. So living end kind of needs to wait to make its living ends like big enough to win. On the other hand, waiting too long can let four colors set up to the point where they have too many layers of interaction arranged, such that Living End can't get anywhere at all. So the trick with Living End is really in the timing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and depending on what Mason brings to the table, William might not feel much pressure to go for that line immediately. So he can spend his turns just cycling through creatures, building towards that big living end. However, if Mason forces the issue with something like a Teferi Time Raveler, or if there's a prospect of, if 3 turns down the line, Mason can Eladamri's Call for Endurance or something like that, then that's something you really have to be conscious of.
I don't think Mason has Eldor's Call.
Okay, so yeah, that's one of these pain points between different lists is do you want a card like that? If so, how many? And then how extensive do you want that toolbox to be? And that is one of the perhaps illegitimate reasons, but one reason regardless for going over that 60 card threshold, as you see a lot of lists doing, is just to pad out that toolbox a little bit.
Well, to be honest, I kind of think that if you have sort of a toolbox with Eldamari's Call or perhaps Primeval Titan, and you want to be able to access more tutor targets, playing more than 60 cards can make sense to have access to kind of more targets in game one. However, if you have no tutors, then I think you're kind of not being honest with yourself, and you should just play 60 cards. That's my opinion. If you want it, like I think that given that Mason does not have any Eldamari's Calls, which is my understanding, he does not. And I think you should play 60.
We've seen people react to the Yorion ban in a lot of different ways. Some people just register the exact same 80 card deck just without a companion or with Kahira instead. Some people go back down to 60 and stay disciplined. And then some people just fall anywhere on that spectrum in between. So if you look at the results of Magic Online, you will see 70 card, 75 card, 65 card, four-color deck list. And then within that, there's a question of, am I elementals? Am I this kind of blink sub-theme deck? There's a lot of stuff going on there. But Mason keeping it simple and just indulging himself a little bit, going up to 62 cards there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest downside of 62 in specifically four color is like, look, if I ask you what's the best card in your four color deck, you're not going to answer, I don't know. That isn't what you're going to say. We all know what the best color deck in 4-color is. It's red and 6.
It's
red
right
and 6
there.
by a lot.
Yes.
Yeah, like, so, like, okay, every additional card you play is, 1% or whatever less games that you will play a red and 6 on turn 2. And I think that percentage adds up. It's a small percent, but, like, that matters.
Even in the Yorion days, noted supercomputer Alan Wu was still playing 60 cards, and so I think that maybe he will have turned out to be right all along, and we'll come back there.
Yes. So that is absolutely true. God, I like MTG Supercomputer. I think that's a fairly good description of the style of play that Alan prefers. But nonetheless, it looks like in the actual game, William has built up a pretty decent graveyard and is perhaps considering whether or not to go for it or how to set things up here.
Now, notably, it looks like he has 2 copies of Living End in his hand. Most Living End deck lists only have 3 copies in the main deck. Sometimes you see the 4th one in the sideboard if you expect to have to try and attempt several Living Ends in a particular game. And so we could be in a position where if one of those Living Ends gets countered, that's it. There are no more Living Ends left in the tank. So that's something where the specifics of the deck list really do matter a lot. Oh, wait, hold on. Uh, People are saying that the 3rd one has already shown up and been put into a graveyard, I think via Wake of Waves. And so, yeah, we we might be in this weird holding pattern where Mason is kind of terrified of a living end around any corner. And we know, and William knows, that's not coming anytime soon.
Well, okay, let's not jump too far to that conclusion yet. I know some lists do play the 4th wing in the main. I agree that 3 is more stock, but 4 is far from unheard of. I don't want to necessarily assume that Will is playing 3 without specific confirmation.
And Mason will not assume that either, even if he had access to that knowledge, because you don't want to assume, well, most lists only play 3, so my opponent's only playing 3, and then find yourself losing a game out of nowhere because the 4th one comes out from Violent Outburst or something. So I'm sure Mason will be playing this game with a lot of vigilance still, and trying to go through the motions properly. And okay, 4 in the main. We are getting confirmation from Anurag here. So this is still very much a normal game of Magic until maybe that 4th one can be that reverse one outer that could end the game at any time.
Yeah, very much agreed. But what it really does is, okay, if Will had more living ends, he could have gone for an EOT Cascade there. Mason would have countered it. He would untap Cascade again and win the game easily. Right? The biggest downside to this is that, well, with only one living end that is usable, or you want to call it, Will has to make sure that one hits, and it's unclear how to bait out that counterspell without putting living end on the stack.
And that's the thing, because you can wait around until you have some form of protection, whether it's a grief or a force negation or something like that. But then if you don't find that, you're giving Mason more and more time to put his defenses up. And then if you spend your time drawing more cards, well, those are more cards that could be the 4th living end will end the game on the spot in the wrong direction.
It looks like there will use the play of bouncing the Ren and 6 to prevent the ultimate, since once the Ren and 6 ults, that single counterspell might be enough to counter, well, everything. So
yeah, there might be some weird wrinkle where you force negation to counterspell or something like that. But yeah, I mean, this is we may be in garbage time, even if it's not the garbage time we thought Eternal show ago.
yeah, I mean, Mason's certainly ahead in this game. I don't think it's over, but I think Williams' path to victory is pretty challenging.
And Mason has so far not needed to attempt any play that is typically good in the matchup. So no Teferi Time Raveler. He hasn't had any cause to put Counterspell on the stack yet. We don't see main deck Endurance or anything like that. So Mason is just kind of here vibing, not really doing much. But that is enough as it stands right now. But there is Force Negation. So William may think now is the time to go for this. And I wonder when he will pull the trigger. There's a case for going on upkeep, I think, but we could see maybe waiting until the end step as well.
Interesting. So just there, Mason tapped to 1 mana, and Will didn't go for it. Why not?
That is a good question. You open yourself up potentially to sorcery speed plays from Mason. So if there are main deck Supreme Verdicts, which is a rarity but possible, or Mason can untap, play Omnath, play a fetch land, and now that is a pretty big buffer that you have to fight through. He may also not be thinking Mason's going to have main deck counterspell, because that actually is a rarity among a lot of 4-color lists these days. So he might think he has more freedom to bob and weave around that as he likes.
That's definitely fair, and certainly 4-color is capable of beating living ends, especially living ends that are kind of on the smaller side, if you will. But still, I think maybe William is missing his opportunity there. I would have been inclined to pull the trigger, although certainly it could go wrong. Uh, so Teferi is going to force the action here. Once Teferi's in play, you can't Cascade anymore. So William figures, well, I guess I'll respond with my Cascade spell then. Might as well. Uh,
Yeah, this is it. The game is going to be decided on this turn, on this interaction. And we'll see if Mason can pick and win this fight here.
I think he can't win the fight, because I think Mason just has Counterspell, and William has Force Mitigation. So I think that the Living End is going to resolve. It's more a question of if Mason can manage to, like, trade off with the Ice Fang, bounce something into Fairy, find an Omnath, and, like, end up, surviving, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So the Ice Fang is going to get killed by the Living End. And at that point, let's see, Mason has a Solitude in his hand, so we can pitch cast that with the Leyline Binding that's still there. Teferi, once it resolves, can bounce back one of the creatures that came back in from the Living End. So that can clean up at least 2 permanents, and that might be enough to get Mason this game here.
See, interestingly, I'm not totally sure it's obvious that Mason should make the Solitude play in response, simply because the Leyline Binding is also kind of a 1-mana way to clean things up if the Living End ends up resolving. Although I guess maybe he can't wait for that, because the counterspell is only 2 mana. It depends on kind of how big the Living End is, which I don't have a great sense of.
Yeah, it looks like there may not have been a copy of Counterspell in the hand in the first place here.
Oh, my apologies. I don't know what that card was then.
Are you thinking one of the Eternal Witnesses was actually a Counterspell? It does look vaguely like a blue card from this angle, but let's see. So 6 creatures all coming in, got to resolve our Architects of War triggers, and then we will see if Mason can clean up the mess.
I mean, I thought I saw a bluish card in his hand, but I guess maybe it was Eternal Witness. Okay, well, if this just happens, then okay. So Mason can, let's see. So he can exile one of the 4/4 flyers. He can bounce another one, and he can trade for one of the 3/3s. But that 5/5 hexproof is going to be a real problem.
Yeah, that's where you really need another Ice Fang Coatl to grease the wheels there. And with Mason solituding his own Coatl, there's not even the line of Eternal Witness, pick up the Coatl and replay it again. So you get that point of life back, but I wonder if that's maybe going to be costly down the line.
Yeah, definitely could be. Although I think Mason's intent is most likely to Ewit back the Solitude or the Teferi once they die, which will probably be close enough to an Ice Fang, if that makes sense. Like, Teferi bouncing a thing is kind of like Ice Fang blocking it. So, of course, maybe William is not going to kill the Teferi, knowing this, thinking like, well, who cares with this one Teferi? I'm just going to get you dead, and no reason to enable any witness you might be holding anyway.
Yeah, I think also trying to attack down Teferi, that could result in an entire additional combat step that you need to finish a job, and at that point you're kind of doing Teferi has done its job by then. So let's see, Mason. Okay, cracks Misty Rainforest. Now, luckily, there was no grief in the pile of creatures that came back, so Mason's hand is as it was before, and we'll see if that's enough to, with 8 mana and a bunch of other resources left in the tank, we'll see if that can get him out of this bind in the next turn or two. But
so
I wonder.
Chad is saying that there's a Zagoth Tribe in play, which means the Street Wraith can't be blocked and therefore has to be bounced.
Okay, so yeah, nestled in the middle there. Yeah, I think Street Wraith bouncing that makes sense anyway because William can't recast it, and whereas if you bounce a Curator of Mysteries, well, that one can just come back down next turn regardless. So we're sending that one back, passing the turn.
I mean, it makes sense assuming Mason can live long enough to exploit that. It's sort of, let's see, he's dying very quickly here. I guess probably not dead this turn, but it's a near thing, right?
Yeah, some people saying that that mystery was in fact the second land drop there. So gonna get a quick confirmation on that. See if we need to pause the game and back up.
That I am honestly completely unsure of. So,
Yeah, that was a very involved turn where a lot happened, and those are the kind of turns that can make that mistake either as a player or as someone trying to keep track of the game from our standpoint too. And yeah, it looks like we have. Are we pausing to address that, or just pausing to consider what's going on here?
so okay, I have a question. So, if William main phases Violent Outburst and alphas, right? Is that lethal?
That is a
So
very good question. So, Solitude jumps in front of, let's say, Strike Riverwinder, and then we have 10 coming across, and then that's 14, 18. We gain 3 back from the Solitude. So, yeah, but on the face of it, that would be lethal.
right. So now, obviously, Mason will know that, right? Because Teferi, William has to just literally like say like, "Here's my Violent Outburst. Is it good enough?" And if Mason has, something like Leyline Binding, Lightning Bolt, kind of any in-speed interaction, he will then cast it. But I think Mason's dead. Because William also has a Brazen Bar, so he can actually clear out the Solitude as a blocker potentially. And although it can still be evoked, then there's no 3 life gained. So I think Mason's dead.
Does William have the 5th land to enable Petty Theft and Violent Outburst? Because we have the Spyblock Canal, but that's coming into play tapped.
Oh, you're right. Okay, so so Mason William can't do that. He has to pick, and that's probably what he's thinking about right now. He's like, should I bounce this? Should I outburst, which is more damage? Is him re-evoking the Solitude good or bad for me? Because at least he loses a card. Like, there's kind of a lot to consider on Will's side here. Because I think we're in Will's main phase at the moment, although I'm not 100% sure.
That is the only place he could take action, so that is where the thought has to occur. And yeah, it looks like there is an old frame Icefang Quaddle there in Mason's hand waiting to jump into combat here as well.
And I believe it does have Death Touch. I think those are 3 basics on Thought lands. So I'm pretty sure that Full Art Island is what I thought was Counterspell. So there you go.
Okay. And William has to be thinking, all right, there is so much removal in this 4-color deck, whether it's Leyline Binding, we've seen 1 copy of that pitched already, a second Solitude could be waiting in the wings, could be just a second Icefang, as it turns out Mason does actually have. So yeah, you have lethal just with your Outburst, assuming nothing else happens. But what if something else happens? And can you play around that in some way, or do you just have to swing for the fences and hope for the best?
Interesting. So it looks like William's taking a pretty conservative line here of like killing the Planeswalkers and only attacking Mason for a few points. And I'm not sure if he's going to get rewarded for this. I mean, presumably what William's thinking is like, look, my opponent doesn't have Supreme Verdict in his deck, probably. The 4 lists usually don't. So, barring an Omnath, I should just be able to take this game down at my leisure. I don't need to rush. But if Mason does find Omnath, he's going to take over the game extremely quickly. And it's not even impossible for Mason to grind this out without the namesake card.
The other problem here as well is, what are those Planeswalkers doing at this point? So Ren 6, Mason has 8 lands in play, potentially more in hand, not lacking for mana by any means. And then the Teferi can maybe bounce something in 3 turns from now if the game lasts that long, which it probably won't if you're attacking Mason directly instead. So it looks like we kind of gave Mason a fog, essentially, and maybe open the window for him to get back in the game now.
Yeah, agreed. I think Will might be playing just a little too conservatively here. Like, he was ahead, and when you're ahead, you can often afford to just play a value game instead of going for the throat. But it seems like he's just giving Mason more outs than he has to as a result. More turns to find his Supreme Verdict, more turns to find the Omnath, etc., etc.
Yeah, it might be a classic case of you try to play around some obscure scenario or play around too many things, and in the process, you end up not playing around the just scenario that's staring you face up on the table, and you just lose to that instead.
Very much agreed. I honestly think a really high percentage of the skill in Magic is kind of identifying the extent to which you're ahead or behind, and therefore, like, how wide a set of things you can or cannot play around, if that makes sense. Kind of playing around the exact perfect amount of stuff is what separates the great from the good.
Yeah, I think you see as players develop, you start out not really playing around anything because you're not aware of it, or maybe you don't know how. And then once you know enough to start playing around things, well, you overcorrect and you start playing around everything everywhere all at once, and in the process, you kind of drop the ball. And then the next step, the synthesis of that, is a kind of proper holistic risk assessment. And I think we may be stuck in that previous phase here.
Yeah. But, okay, William's not out of it. Mason still needs to string together something pretty impressive to get out of the situation. There's a lot of pretty scary creatures still in play. And there is a chance that Will's going to start hard casting here pretty soon.
Yeah, so Eternal Witness gets back the Icefang Coatl, threatening to trade with that Strike Riverbinder. So yeah, Mason just continuing to play his cards, not doing anything really exceptional here. I think clawing his way back into this game.
Yeah, and I mean, the Icewind Quaddle is brutal here because the Strike Riverwinder is the hardest creature for 4 color to remove by a lot. Basically, Icefang is the only answer, and Mason had already expended 2 of them. But Ewit picking back up that the second one might just be the difference maker here.
And this is what makes Icefang such an appealing card in these decks, is that it is your ideal play to just do something on turn 2 if your opponent doesn't force your hand on anything else. Great way to threaten an exchange with a Ragavan early or something like that. And then once you get to turn 6 or turn 7 and the Death Watch is online, well, suddenly this is, terminate draw card in your control deck. And that's a great place to be as well.
Yeah, very much agreed. Now, I know that a lot of these flying lists have kind of cut Icefang as kind of a casualty of the Yorion loss, thinking like, well, it doesn't have Death Touch till later, so it's kind of not doing all that much for me, and I can't blink to draw a card anymore, so it ends up being one of the 80 shaved. It's interesting that Mason has chosen to still keep it around, and I wonder if partially he can justify doing that because of the 2 extra slots.
I wonder, yeah, and that's But we'll ask him about that if we get the chance to speak to the 6'2" man himself after this match here. Uh, looking good to have another winners interview at this stage. Has this game on pretty solidly in the bag, but and I think the post board games get a lot better for the 4 color deck than they do for Living End.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, certainly Living In can win post board. It's not like some sort of unassailable hill, but losing game 1 is absolutely brutal for this deck. Honestly, in most matchups, but certainly in this one. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what Williams' route to victory is at this point. I think he kind of just needs to hard cast some creatures and hope Mason just draws nothing. But that's a dubious plan at the best of times.
Yeah, and which of these creatures do you even want to petty theft? Right, both of them have additional. So I guess Mason doesn't have the second mana to recast this right now, so we do get to attack. That's something, I suppose. But again, going for the Teferi, which I don't see what the goal is here.
Yeah, I think Will's been a bit too trigger shy this game, but so be it.
Yeah, just looking at the math on the screen right now, Mason's at 9. How much in terms of power was sent at the Reno 6 and the Teferi over the past turn or two?
And I think over 9 damage, to be honest. Yeah, I think Mason's going to snatch victory from the Jaws defeat here because of these William kind of awkward Planeswalker attacks and Mason's Ewit to recur the Ice Fang to handle this 5/5 hexproof. And Mason's iterating, just getting more and more value.
And there is the 1 copy of Supreme Verdict. So that might actually cause William to throw in the towel here. He's fighting on gamely so far, but I think that's going to seal the deal.
Yeah, probably. Because once he's Supreme Verdicts, Mason also has the Ice Fang lined up for William's next threat. Like, it's pretty brutal.
And Witness attacking here is a terrible sign if you're William.
Oh, yeah. It basically means the Supreme Verdict is coming, I think. It's hard to imagine what else it could possibly mean.
Now, so bearing in mind, as we are maybe in garbage time here, that this stream is brought to you by Drip, would you say that either player has displayed a particular amount of drip so far?
Well, how do you feel about Mason's basics? Would you say those have some drip?
Those are quite polarizing. I know they have their advocates, have people who don't like them as well. We got we got to talk to William about these Guilds of Ravnica shocklands. It's a disgrace to the stream, honestly.
You really prefer the original old school Shocklands? Is what you're saying? You don't like the Guilds of Ravnica? I don't know, alternatives.
But I go in descending order. You know, the original Ravnica block, those are perfection, and then Return to Ravnica, like, yeah, okay, fair enough. And then by the time we get to Guilds of Ravnica, we're just kind of phoning it in. But then we have like the secret layer ones, we have those space ones from Infinity. So you can definitely customize your Shockland options if you're so inclined.
Okay, so this is interesting what's happening here, actually. So what's occurring is Mason is holding the verdict, I think respecting additional living ends, because he doesn't know that William is unable to living end again. From Mason's perspective, there's 2 living ends in the bin, Will has at least 1 to 2 more. Right? So as a result, he's just taking things conservatively, not playing the verdict, I think, and just going to Ice Fang the 5 of Hexproof and take 3 from the Brazen Borrower, I think.
Yeah, there is a grief in the graveyard. So if there were another living end, the grief could snag the Supreme Verdict, and then we'd be back to square one. But if Mason is keeping track of the known living ends, so one of them was binned, the other one was cast off Cascade earlier, and then I don't know how much of Williams' deck he revealed when he cascaded, because there's one living end left. Maybe we had to go through a bunch of cards. So I don't know if Mason's assuming there has to be at least one living and left in the tank. And now, okay, now the jig is up. We are playing with private information.
Hey, Anzi says he saw all but 3 cards, in which case Mason should know that even if William didn't already have these living ends, he would have drawn them because there was not a shuffle since then, right? So
yes, and I know that you are famously against Magic math, but it's an interesting math problem of you see all but 3 cards. What are the odds that all of the living ends are clustered in the bottom of the deck like that?
even if they are, though, those 3 cards have been drawn since then. So
so 0% is the answer here.
yes, I believe it's less of a math problem and more of a logic problem. But yeah, I guess I'm not totally sure why Mason's choosing to throw the Supreme Verdict, but I also don't think it matters. He's kind of deep in garbage time at this point. Omnath can gain 8 life a turn. That pretty much handles Williams' entire board on its own. It can attack while it's doing it. There's a backup Omnath in the hand, and an iteration for more value, and a Supreme Verdict. I just don't think there's any path back for William.
We do have to be a little conscious of time in this round as well. This game has dragged on quite a bit, and these games can go on long from both sides, lots of decisions back and forth. So, Mason, thinking about how to close the deal here in game one, and also how to do it within a relevant time frame, because you don't want to be picking up a draw at this stage in the tournament.
Yeah, definitely true. In fact, when you play this 4-color deck, you kind of need to think about the clock from turn 1 of game 1 typically. And at this point, when you're deep in garbage time, the clock should be the only thing you're thinking about. Mason should be trying to take his game actions as quickly as possible. It doesn't even really matter if they're correct anymore. It's more important to end the round than anything else.
And this was especially true, and you would know this better than anyone, in the Yorion days, where if you were in, God forbid, the Mirror, but also other grindy matchups as well, you kind of had to suss out whether your opponent had that sense of urgency from the get-go, and if not, just have an honest conversation with them about, if we both understand get this done and get a result here one way or the other.
Yes, very much agreed. I mean, look, like in the post-board games, 4-color can't win quickly, but Living End absolutely can. Like Living End is very capable of resolving its namesake card on 3, backing up with Force Negation or whatever, and then ending the game on its turn 4. So you have to be ready to go quick.
So Mason does finally pick up this game one here, and then we don't know exactly what tools both players are working with, or we get to see them scanning through here quickly. So several endurances, Flusterstorm from Mason's side. You do see him going past the copies of Dress Down, which I don't know if there's is an issue. You see Mason maybe gesturing to a judge quickly. I don't know if those Dress Downs were where they were meant to be necessarily, but is that a card that you like in this matchup?
It's okay. I typically don't have it in, but I don't think it's unreasonable. It stops grief and subtlety, is what it does. and it's not uncommon to end up in these weird like flash plan Bs, hard cast threats phase. It also can let you answer Striped Riverwinder in weird spots. I don't mind one or two, but I usually lean towards not. If I have them in, it means my deck is not that well configured with the Lingen matchup, which to be clear might be the case. Uh, but I think Mason has enough better cards that he might not board it in. It's hard to say for sure though, since I do not have his exact configuration memorized. Uh, like it's just that like okay, Mason's definitely good at boarding the 3 endurances. He's definitely good at boarding the 3 Chalice of the Voids. He's definitely good at boarding the 2 Flusterstorms, and he's definitely good at boarding the 2 Supreme Verdicts, right? So at that point, I'm kind of skeptical that there's space for these dress downs. But I might be wrong.
Yeah,
Obviously, almost all the spot rule can go.
that is a lot of cards for the Living End matchup. And Living End is not a deck which you expect to have to beat in every modern tournament the way that it was maybe a year and a half ago. It's floating on the fringes, still a threat you have to respect. But I wonder if William is going to suffer collateral damage from Mason preparing for the Rhinos matchup, where that's the matchup where Chalice of the Void is excellent, where you want the additional Supreme Verdict, and a lot of those cards have that crossover damage against Living End.
Yeah, so it does look like Mason's boarding out like basically all of the spot removal. Now it's I think it's sort of debatable whether you should have literally all of it out or leave a few in because it's not actually that uncommon for 4 color to end up winning a game in which Living End resolved. And so leaving in like a few lightning bolts, maybe a leyline binding or two, isn't out of the question. However, it seems like Mason is going for the absolutely no removal approach and just trying to stop Living End from resolving at all costs.
Yeah, I think he likes most of his other cards enough that there's just no room, even if you think, I want a leyline binding onto I just don't know if there is room for them, even in his 62 card main deck.
I mean, if we're getting Ice Fang, we're definitely not going to have any spot removal in. I mean, Ice Fang
Yes.
is better than any spot removal spell. So, uh, it does seem that that's where Mason is landing. And I mean, this is a fine strategy. I'm definitely not trying to be critical of it. It puts you in a position where you kind of need to play the game like a blue-white control deck. It kind of makes your Omnaths more awkward, your expressive iterations. It makes it hard for you to play at sorcery speed because you're so all in on stopping that Living End sort of preemptively. But that said, it can totally work, and if you have enough cards to pull it off, it's a very viable strategy.
And then from William's side, we don't get a good look at what he's doing. What kind of cards would you expect him to be shuffling in and out here?
Typically in this matchup, I would expect the Living End player to bring Subtleties. Oh wait, we actually are getting a look here. Okay, I think that was Subtleties, Mystical Disputes, and Endurances were the cards boarded in, I believe. That's interesting. Mystical Disputes and Subtleties are bog standard anti-4 color cards. I would expect to see those from basically everyone all the time. Endurance is interesting. Endurance is suggesting he's trying to play more of a flash game and less of a Living End game. And sometimes Living End can do this thing where they kind of like play an Endurance, start pressuring with it, subtlety your 4-drop, untap, attack you for 6, and then just like don't even need Living End to win. So that I think is the sort of strategy William is taking this matchup. I'm not sure how many artifact or enchantment rule spells he boarded in. But usually they will have a few extra against 4-color post board just to handle any chalices that do resolve.
Yeah, that's another wrinkle from the Living End side is you have to hedge against hard hate cards like Chalice of the Void with stuff like Foundation Breaker, which really is not a card you ever want to draw under other circumstances. So you have to hedge against that, and then you have enough other cards that you want to board in anyway. Here is a deep question for you. At the point where your opponent knows that you're bringing in subtlety, is it actually subtle anymore?
Yeah, I honestly think subtlety is not that well named a card. I don't think it's very subtle. Um, like when I think subtlety in Magic, I think of cards that have a lot of finesse, like Vendilion Click. Like sometimes you target them, sometimes you target you, sometimes you cast it draw steps, sometimes you cast it EOT, sometimes you cast it main phase. It's a very what you do when you do it. Subtlety's like, look, you put a spell in the stack that subtlety can target, and you subtlety it. Everyone knows what's going to happen here. It's pretty good, but it's not subtle.
I feel like the rest of that cycle, whether it's grief or fury or solitude, we're talking about the emotions that those cards inspire in the opponent when you cast them. So those are very aptly named. And then subtlety is just very abstract. It's, I am subtle, and then that's the extent of it. It's a very selfish card in that sense.
Yeah, I think Subtlety might be one of the least aptly named. Whereas Grief, I think, is an incredibly accurate name. Anyone who's ever been griefed knows that it induces some grief. You don't usually feel great when you get griefed.
No. And so Mason has a hand which is missing, third land, missing some colors, but two copies of Teferi. We have Solitude to pitch cast in the case of an early emergency living end, and then iteration to maybe find the third land, find something else. I wonder if Mason, having both Teferis in hand, is iteration just going to be an anticipate here?
Yeah, I think it definitely might be. Well, it's not just anticipate, right? So the situation here for Mason is he really needs to do something before turn 2. Because if the living end player just cycles some stuff, casts Living on 3, like on Mason's upkeep or whatever, Mason's currently completely cold to it. But if you cast Iteration on 2 and you happen to hit Chalice of the Void, then you're all set, right? So I think it's very plausible that we're going to see Mason fire off this iteration, presuming he doesn't draw other interaction to cast.
Yeah, having 5 to 6 cards, which if you hit them off the iteration, drastically improve your chances of winning the game, I think makes it mandatory to fire it off, even if you do have a third land rolled.
Yes. Yes, 5 to 6, sorry, being Endurance or Chalice. Yes, I failed to mention Endurance, but that is a good point. Um, be clear, I would definitely keep this 6 for Mason, but I think this is not actually a very good 6. Like, when I'm playing 4 color against this deck, I'm really looking for the early interaction more than anything else that this hand lacks. Not saying they should have mulliganed, I think clear keep. I just think when I keep this hand, I'm thinking, oh god, I guess I'll keep this, but so much could go wrong.
Yeah, I think once Mason is on 6, though, going to 5 starts to look like a dicey proposition. So I don't hate the keep, but Mason, I'm sure, kept it knowing what the obvious ways he could lose from here are.
It looks like Mason found something, is what I would guess, right? Like, I think he would have fired off the iteration if he'd drawn nothing. So I believe leaving up this mana, like, sort of implies that he has some sort of interaction.
Yeah, maybe he drew the Flusterstorm or something like that.
Maybe not. Maybe he's just trying to bluff. Oh, but I don't think this is going to
Right,
go
here
well for him.
goes.
See, I think William kind of has it all here. That is to say, I think William has a Cascade spell and a Mystical Dispute for this. Can just respond by putting in 8 power, can counter the Teferi. It's kind of whatever he wants to do here.
And yeah, there's a top card. So Solitude getting pitched. So that is going to eat the Street Wraith just as it comes in. And then we're looking at Teferi and Solitude against Strike Riverwinder, which is not clearly favored for either player, I would argue.
Yeah. See, I think Will was maybe got a little too trigger happy here. Like, I think perhaps he was supposed to Mystical Dispute the Teferi, untap the next turn, and then cycle some more stuff, and then go for Living End. Like, not rush it in some sense. Like, even one more creature in the bin could have been a big difference maker here. But now Mason might be able to recover. Like, he just needs to find a way to answer the Strike Riverwinder, be that Supreme Verdict or Ice-Fang Coatl, and he's kind of all set. Teferi's on the table.
Yeah, and the Teferi this turn can tick up to 6 loyalty, which means taking it off the board with the Riverwinder is going to take 2 turns and 10 missed damage. And so Mason has a lot of time to just do stuff and get something together here.
Yes, and Williams' main plan B, that is this like endurance subtlety flash game, doesn't work as well if you have to play at sorcery speed, which Teferi does demand. Okay, so we're seeing grief from William. Okay, Mason is out of gas. Oh, I think the game is quite close.
Someone in chat is saying that given that the Living End was the top card, it was good to do it rather than draw it. I'm no statistician or a mathematician, Andrew. I don't know if that's how it works exactly.
Yeah, I think we need to assess all plays under the belief that his library was a probability distribution, and the Living End happened to being on top is a coincidence. It doesn't really change what the right play is. Although I think potentially Will may be rewarded for his incorrect play. Actually, a punt down, if you will.
If it's not a coincidence and it is known information, I have further follow-up questions for the players here. But
oh, man. Okay, so William did choose to go after the Ren. I think sensing that Mason is really low on material, so just trying to like reduce kind of his resources as far as possible, not let him do, for example, Ren Ottawa shenanigans, if he happens to have that. But it does mean that Teferi is sticking around even longer.
Yeah, Mason is at 23 with a Teferi that isn't dying anytime soon, and we just have a 5-5 against the world here.
Okay, so here's a question. You're William. Let's say for your turn you drew Curator of Mysteries. Would you cast it?
Yeah, if I drew it, I think I attach a fairy and then cast my Curator of Mysteries.
Okay. I think it's sort of close because, like, I think there's a chance William does win this game with another living end later. You know, he's not necessarily going to win only with hardcasting creatures, but he could win that way. That's why I think it's sort of interesting. Like sometimes, like let's say Mason had like a Chalice the Void stuck and Indigenous Fairy, William might be thinking, okay, I'm like so far from ever living ending that my only chance is hardcasting. But that's not really the case here. Here it's like, well, I might win this game by hardcasting, but I might living end again. It's sort of unclear.
Okay, Supreme Verdict. That card does actually deal with the 5-5 hit. That one is back in the bin, and so now William has to get the Teferi off the battlefield and then find a way to force through another living end. Which one of those may be difficult. I think both is going to be a tall order here.
Yes, I think Mason finding that Supreme Verdict was a big swing, and William is now officially in trouble.
And Mason just drew Endurance, so that is going to be another another wrinkle in that.
Yeah, I think William somewhat failed to thread the needle this game. Like again, it's very tricky. I don't blame him at all, but I think this living end was just too small. Like it was basically cleaned up by a single Solitude, and you just need more than that. You have to be a little more patient against four color. They're too good at beating small living ends.
Okay, there is Odawara in William's hand, so that can put the Teferi back in Mason's hand end of turn, and then we can try and force through the living end. And Mason right now only has one green source, so can't hardcast the Endurance, and I'm not sure exactly what that other card is, but if it isn't a green source or another green card, then that might actually be somewhat feasible. But I don't like this. Okay, pitch casting Endurance, fine.
Interesting.
I don't know why we're doing this now. If the plan is to Odawara and then Cascade, I think you can just afford to wait a turn. Um, so this is just a 2-2. So if we're doing this, why not just cast the Endurance?
Yeah, I'm very confused. I don't understand. I don't understand what just happened. Like I don't know if William thought something different would happen, or like got a little confused about his sequencing. Thought he'd already bounced the Fury like in his head. You know, definitely something that can happen to even very strong players. But I don't know what's going on. Or wait, is there a living end count issue? How many living ends are exiled?
Oh god, not this again.
Well, it could legitimately be okay. I'm pretty sure there was at least one living end pitched to grief. If there was another living end pitched to grief, and the living end that's been cast, and William ported out a living end, which is not uncommon, porting down from 4 to 3, that he might be out of living ends. Now, I'm not saying I know that to be the case. I definitely don't. I just think it would explain his actions to some extent.
I would think this is the matchup where you want the maximum count of living ends, but if you have that many cards to bring in, then maybe something has to give.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know. I'm not too sure how many like in what circumstance you'd have 3 versus 4. I assume it's kind of a vibes thing. Uh, maybe William was just feeling 3 today. I'm not sure. Hmm.
This is definitely a pro vibe stream. Ideally good vibes, but all vibes are beautiful.
Oh, wait. Okay, so he gets through with this, and so if Mason still doesn't have a green card somehow, I think this is game winning. Uh,
Oh, okay. Green card found. And yeah, I think that is going to settle it here.
that's savage because what that means is not only does Will lose his entire graveyard, also Mason gets back endurance. Uh, which is going to accelerate the clock quite a bit.
And I would wager. So Mason has endurances and chalices. I don't think the overlap between them is a big priority for Mason. It's just that, hey, I want some endurances in my deck against, let's say, these Fair Breach decks, maybe Murktide decks like that, and I want these chalices in my deck. And if I hit this one exact matchup where both of those cards are good, great, I'm golden, and that has manifested itself here.
Yeah, I agree with you for sure. I think, I mean, I think this has actually kind of been true about four color sideboards for a while. That like they kind of heavily target living end mostly without even meaning to. Uh, Although I think partially it depends on how high you are on endurance against the fair decks. That is to say, I'm kind of an endurance skeptic out of four color against Murktide. So if I expected a lot of Murktide, I don't know how many endurances I'd actually have. However, if you expect more fair breach and less traditional Murktide, that would incline me to play endurance again. So it's a bit complicated.
Yeah, Mason did seem worried about Fair Breach specifically, and so I think that may be another case of, hey, this is where I want these cards, and if I get paired against Murktide, maybe these are marginal upgrades to whatever other cards are in my deck.
Okay, so yeah, I think what happened there is that Mason jumped the gun a little bit, like cast the endurance in response to Divine Outburst, and so as a result, William then, when he cascaded, just chose not to cast the Living End, keeping Living End in the deck and not bringing back the endurance. Whereas Mason should have waited for the cascade trigger to put Living End on the stack before evoking it. I don't think this is going to matter, but it's a small misstep there.
And yeah, the game is going to be over regardless here. Mason Clark going to move on to 5-1. His four-color Omnath deck, defeating Living End in what I think is a good matchup. It can be scary if you're against a Living End pilot who really knows what. We see a few missteps there, I think, from William, and making Mason's life a little bit easier.